Great. Thank you so much, Christelle. My name is Marni Panas. As we heard, I use she and her pronouns. I'm grateful to bring this session to you. This is a bit of a scaled down presentation that we often do within Alberta Health Services to my AHS colleagues. If you want the full version, you're more than welcome to join in any of our My Learning Link sessions. When we talk about diversity and inclusion, creating that safe and inclusive environment and breaking down barriers for people to access healthcare, the first thing we have to do is reflect on our own selves and how are we contributing to that environment of safe and inclusive care, or maybe impeding that. And that starts with reflecting on our own biases. So this is where we're going to take this conversation today. I don't have anything to disclose for today's session. We're going to start first by sharing a few slides. I want you to consider the people that you see on these slides, these pictures, and just make a mental note as to the first few impressions that you have. This exercise isn't about stopping you from having first impressions. We all have them, but they do have an impact on the rest of our relationship and interactions with the individuals. So just make a mental note of the first few things that come to your mind. And here we go. That's it. I probably gave you much more time than you needed to build your first impressions. Now, let's add some context to the individuals. Is it challenge what you've thought of when you first saw them? Does it add anything new? The first woman we see is Ashley Collingbull. She's the first Indigenous woman, the first Canadian to win Miss Universe title in 2015. She participated in Amazing Race Canada with her dad. She's from Enoch Cree Nation, just west of Edmonton, a graduate of NAIT and the U of A. Does this change what you assumed about Ashley when you first saw her picture? For a period of time, her and I even served as on the Family Centered Care Council to Stollery Children's Hospital. Does this change anything that you saw? What about Chris Gardner? He's an American entrepreneur, investor, stockbroker, motivational speaker. In the early 80s, he struggled with homelessness to raise his toddler son. You might recognize this story from the book called Pursuit of Happiness, which later became a movie starring Will Smith. How does this challenge your notion of people who experience homelessness? What perspectives and gifts and potential are we missing when we can't see past a shopping cart? Haben Girma is an American woman, the first deafblind graduate of Harvard Law School. She was recognized by the Obama administration for her work. Aside from that great work, she's an avid salsa dancer, loves to surf and travel. Again, what perspectives and potential are we missing when we can't see past somebody's disabilities, or we're surprised when people have disabilities that we weren't aware of? Do-Wan Chang and his wife Jin Suk moved to America from Korea in 1981, where he worked 3 jobs to support his family, including as a janitor, gas station attendant, and a coffee shop. Eventually, they opened their own clothing store, which became known as Forever 21, 480 stores up until a couple of years ago, $3 billion a year in sales. The media coverage will often have us have a negative image of immigration. We hear language like taking our jobs and resources, but in actuality, immigration supports GDP growth. In fact, that's what our country needs to survive. In 2019, we found a study that showed that there are more jobs created by small business owners who weren't born in Canada than who were born in Canada. And of course, it's beyond, immigration is beyond the numbers and the GDP growth, but the richness of our communities. Finally, we have Tess Holliday. She was the first American model and the first model of her size to be signed to a major agency. She appeared in several colors, was named the world's top plus model by Vogue Italia. She starred in the body positive movement, #FYourBeautyStandards, and works to empower people to embrace the body they're in right now. Weight bias, and people experience obesity. There's a strong bias about many things. I remember a story of a woman who kept going to a physician and to a number of physicians talking about her back pain. And everybody just said, well, if you just lost a little bit of weight, you would probably be okay. Finally, the forced physician sent her to an MRI where they found a tumor in her spine. And so often we dismiss or experiences because for other reasons. Now, this exercise wasn't about stopping first impressions. We all have them. But again, they do have an impact on how we provide care, often the decisions that we make. The best way to introduce a bias into somebody is when you're transitioning care from one person to another, say, oh no, oh, you've got that difficult patient. That difficult patient, Marni. And now we've already introduced a bias that Marni has to work that much harder to be believed, to be respected, to be valued. And Marni doesn't have a clue as to why. And so do we set each other up for success or failure? So let's talk about the science of unconscious bias a little bit. The human mind works at 2 levels. We've got the high level. It's intuitive, it's rational, deliberate, slow. or it's explicit. And then there's the low level, the subconscious part of our brain that's intuitive, automatic, we think fast, unconscious. The brain takes what it receives from the low level part of our brain to make conscious decisions. It is the low level, the subconscious, the most primitive part of our brain that controls our conscious experience. And sometimes we're not even aware that it does that. So here's a bit of a test. I want everybody to look at the two squares that you see on your screen that are marked with an A and a B. I'm going to tell you that they're the exact same shades of gray. I know this, some of you are going to be like, what is wrong with Marni? They're not the same shade of gray, but they actually are. And once I start to remove the context, you start to see that, in fact, they are the same shade of gray. I know your mind is blown, so let's just try that again. You can see how once we start to remove the context, it changes the color, because the brain is interpreting the shading, the tubing, all of the different pieces to make those pathways, and then starting to make judgments based on that. And clearly, we don't always make the right decision when that is happening. So you don't know how it is happening. You don't know that it is happening. This is the essence of unconscious awareness, that the rational, deliberate, the high level part of your brain takes what it receives from the subconscious to make conscious decisions. And it is how that low level consciousness is the basis for which we make many decisions. And we don't always get it right. And we don't always, and we're not even aware of it. So the first thing that we have to realize that if you've got a brain, you're biased. We all have bias. I have bias, you have bias, we all have bias. Bias is learned very early on. At the age of 3, children start to understand the difference in people and prejudice. In fact, there's a doll study test that shows if you ask children in play school age to sit at a table, and in front of them is a white doll and a black doll, the child is more likely to pick up the white doll first and more likely to attribute strength-based positive characteristics to the white doll than the black doll. It doesn't matter often the color of the child that's asked to play with the doll. Now, you might find people have exceptions to their bias. Have you ever heard anybody say, oh, I'm not racist, I know black people. I'm not homophobic, my brother-in-law is gay. People might find exceptions to the bias, but the underlying bias is still there. We all have it. It's part of our normal human development. It's part that impacts the fight, flight, fright part of our brain. So what is bias? It's that often inaccurate mental association we make based on limited facts or own lived experience that can give people an unearned advantage and an unearned disadvantage in society. So let's talk about this for a minute. If I said nail or said hammer, are you more likely to think nail or are you more likely to think cotton ball? Now, of course, everybody comes up, well, that's ridiculous, Marni, it's nail. Everybody thinks of nail. Of course, everything that we've ever done with the hammer is associated with the nail. They hang the nails with the hammers in the hardware store. Those quick associations that we make can reveal our own biases. When I describe these individuals to you, who do you see? When I say the word immigrant, who do you see? Do you see somebody who's white with a UK accent from London, or do you see somebody with brown skin from the Middle East? And why? When I say the parents are here with the child, do you see mom and a dad, or do you see two moms? If I say somebody with an addiction, who do you see? And when people don't live up to those expectations, do we treat them differently? Do we treat them less effectively? That is the impact of our biases. So if you're really honest with yourself and think about who do you see, those quick relationships can reveal those biases. Those are those attitudes and stereotypes that affect our understanding and actions in an unconscious manner, activated involuntarily, without our control, can either be positive or negative. We are all susceptible. Researchers tell us the brain takes in 11 million pieces of information through all of our senses. The sight, sound, smell, every cell in our body as it interacts with the environment around us is building those pathways in the brain. The brain is a very efficient tool. It wants to make the less resistance to make decisions. But of those 11 million pieces of information, the brain is only consciously aware of 40. Only 40 pieces of information. So what's happening? Well, think about the last time you drove into the office. Have you driven the same way every day for 5 years and you can't remember the last 10 minutes you drive? That's what's happening. How did you even get here? A little scary. The brain is used to processing the streets that you drove down, the trees that you drove by, the houses that you drove by. But today you're thinking of something different. Today you're thinking, I wonder what those COVID numbers are today. That patient that came into the ER who was coding, I wonder if they made it through the night. So consciously, you're now thinking of that. Subconsciously, the brain is already used to processing everything else that it's used to. So it's going to go back to the subconscious. No matter how hard you try, you can't remember the last 10 minutes of your drive. The brain just isn't wired to do that. That is what we talk about unconscious thinking and automatic thinking. Why does this matter? Why do we talk about unconscious bias? Because we know that we all absorb bias every moment through all of our senses. We're always absorbing biases. We know that people are usually unaware of their biases. In fact, we're not even aware of our biases until somebody else points them out to us, or we take something like the implicit association tests. We know that our unconscious bias may predict our behaviors. If we start to predict our behaviors in that we know how much time we're going to spend with the patient, or we're not going to listen to them, or different interactions, or if that person's coming in, they're probably coming in to seek medication, so we're probably not going to give them a prescription. If it starts to predict our behaviors, that's when it becomes a problem. And what's really important to recognize that it's non-dominant groups that are most impacted by our conscious bias. And that includes women, Indigenous people, people of color, LGBTQ+ people. Non-dominant groups are most impacted by bias. That's why this matters. The Neuro Leadership Institute names about 150 types of biases. First of all, bias can be a positive thing. Bias doesn't have to be a bad thing. Again, it's part of our normal human development. It helps us make sense of the world around us, the people, places, things, keeps us safe. I don't need to know that the lion behind me is hungry. I don't need to know that I'm on the menu. All I know is I got to run at least faster than the next slowest person. It keeps us safe. It makes things easier for me. So of course, bias can be a good thing, but bias can also give people an unearned disadvantage in society. So the Neuro Leadership Institute names about 150 different types of biases, but they're all categorized into 5 different categories of bias, depending on which part of our brain is activated during that bias and our response to them. So I'm just going to go through the summaries. We can go into more detail in another session, but I want to go through these 5 categories. The first being similarity bias, which is most biases fit into this similarity bias, which basically means people like me are better than people who aren't like me. It's the in-group, out-group thing. We have we're more likely to be protective of the in-group than we are of people who aren't like us. Even if we split this group up into different groups, you'd be more likely to support your own group, even though you don't even know them. Probably the most profound example of similarity bias is colonization. People came to Turtle Island and looked at the people living here and said, you know what, our people are better than the people that are here. People like us are better than others. So we're going to stop you from speaking your language. We're going to stop you from practicing your traditions. In fact, we're going to take your children away from you and teach them to be more like us, because people like us are better than people who aren't like us. Didn't work out so great for Indigenous communities. That is a profound example of similarity bias that still perpetuates. We see expedience bias, the bias of fast thinking. Sometimes you have very limited knowledge and you have to make quick decisions. We don't always make the best decisions. So we often go with, if it feels right, it must be right. If it's the first thing that comes to mind, it must be right. Then there's experience bias. We see the world as it is, and we only see everything, and we see everything there is to see. We're only looking and interpreting the world through our lens, and we're making decisions based on that lens. So as a white woman, I might say, I don't experience racism. By definition, I can't experience systemic racism, so I don't experience it. So I might say, racism isn't the problem. We shouldn't have to focus on this, but trans stuff, we should talk about that. If I only ever look through that lens, then we would not be able to make the changes that are necessary. Distance bias. We value things closer to us in terms of time and space simply because they're closer. We are more impacted by what we heard on the news today than what we heard a year ago. And then the last category is safety bias. We are more sensitive to threats to our existence and to us as individuals than we are to rewards. It takes 10 positive news stories about one situation to have the same impact as one negative story. Here in Edmonton or in Alberta, we're going through a series of elections coming up on Monday. And if you pay attention to campaigns, they really tapped into that. A lot of campaigns really focus on, don't vote for that person, this is why, rather than why you should vote for me, because they've tapped into this bias of safety bias. Now, the impact of that can go from all over the place, just from saying the wrong thing to something that is quite profound. And so I want to share the story, of course, of Brian Sinclair. Brian Sinclair, an Indigenous man who in 2000 and a 45-year-old Indigenous man that many of you know, and visited the emergency room of Winnipeg Health Sciences Center in 2008. There he was referred to an ER by a community physician with a bladder infection. He waited and waited and waited some more. While he was waiting, he vomited on himself a number of times. Other ER visitors pleaded with nurses and security guards to tend to him. Finally, after 34 hours of waiting, Mr. Sinclair had already died of a bladder infection in the waiting room with ever receiving treatment. So what happened here? When we looked at the review of the information, we saw that 17 different staff members observed Mr. Sinclair, all made different assumptions as to why he was there. Some thought he'd been triaged already, waiting for a bed in the back. Some thought he'd been treated and discharged. Many thought he was drunk, waiting for a ride home. Some thought he just needed a warm place to rest on a cold winter night in Winnipeg. You know, the finding here is that when people make assumptions that people aren't in need of medical treatment, perhaps even in pain medication, because of the judgments that somebody makes on somebody's appearance, in Brian Sinclair's case, this was a death sentence. And while a lot of you, folks might think, I'm not in an ER, I'm not in a situation where somebody might be coding, I'm not in a place where this might happen, where I'd have an impact. But the fact is, folks, I want you to really think about, do we all live and work in a culture where jokes go unchallenged, where biases go unquestioned, where myths go unchecked? Because we all contribute to a culture where an outcome like this can happen and does happen. In Brian Sinclair's case, on his death certificate, it'll probably say he died of a bladder infection, septicemia, sepsis, something related to his infection. But the true cause of Brian Sinclair's death that will never appear on a death certificate is racism. Racism was the cause of Brian Sinclair's death. And that's something that we all have to think about. What do we do to contribute to that? Now, I know that that's pretty heavy, and I only had 25 minutes, so I wanted to make sure that we felt that the true impact of what our biases can be. But it's not all bad news. There's something that we can do. Being aware of your biases, that you even have them, is the most important way to address the impact of our biases. We can't change that we have biases. We can't change our biases, but we can address the impact of our biases. So first, be willing to admit that you have them. Own them. I have got a lot of biases. I've got anti-trans biases in many ways that I have to focus through all the time. Being willing to examine them. What are the triggers? Why do we feel a certain way when somebody comes into a room and somebody else? Where does that come from? What are behaviors? Being mindfully aware of our behaviors. And then to think about some strategies to overcome those biases. First of all, avoiding blame and guilt. Blame and guilt, feeling shame, feeling guilt is a really motivating factor to change my own behaviors. But guilting somebody else, it's not going to make a difference. Or in fact, it's probably going to even entrench them in their views. If I say you're racist because you did this, if you're homophobic because you did this, if you're selfish because you don't wear a mask, you're not giving them any other options but to be those things. So by guilting somebody else, you want to bring people into conversations and not label them in such a way, because it's not going to work. Focus on your impact and not the intent. We always have to be monitoring, does the impact of our words and behavior match our intent? Because we can't change how something has been received by just simply saying, oh, it wasn't my intention. I didn't mean anything by it. Because the fact is, the impact has already happened. The only thing that we can change in that equation are our behaviors and our words. So that's something that we have to reflect on our own. When you recognize bias and see it, take action, start to ask questions. Doing nothing isn't an option. We have to check each other. When somebody is saying, I remember working with somebody who was in an ER, and we did this session, and then a year later I did the session, and the same nurse sat in this session. And the first time she sat in the session, she was a new nurse, new to the profession, new in the ER. A year later, she talked about her experience in the ER. Two women came into the ER. One woman was really slurred speech, wasn't very responsive. And so they kept asking her questions about pain medication. What medication is she on? And the graduate nurse said, I don't think that's what this is. I don't think that's what this is. So they all paused in that moment and pivoted, and they sent her for MRI, where they found the aneurysm that had burst just moments after. And so by being able to have a safe environment where people can ask each other and say with confidence, I don't think that's what this is, and to be believed and to be supported, could have saved this person's life. So that's the environment that we need to create. So recognize bias and taking a stand is something that we should all create a culture where that is acceptable. Choose a positive attitude. It's been a tough 18 months, folks. There's no question about it, but we can still treat each other with kindness and respect and with a smile. Instead of microaggressions, think about ways in which we can support relationships and support messages. In active listening, we want to make sure that we're listening not to think about, oh, what am I going to say next to respond to what they're saying, but listening to seek to understand and learn. Be intentional. Practice inclusion, monitor behaviors. You know, I'm hearing there's about 1,600 people on this call. I'm going to challenge each of you folks, the next time you go into your clinics, into your hospitals, wherever you're going, is to say good morning with a smile to 3 people that you've never said good morning to. People that you've seen before, but you've never said good morning to. And just monitor their reaction, because they've probably seen you before, and just think about what's that ripple going to be. If 3 of us, if we all did that to 3 people, that's 5,000 people that's going to get a smile that wouldn't have got one. Think of the ripple that you can have by choosing inclusion and kindness. Instead of making statements like they are, they all are, because that we're putting everybody into one big box and setting the stereotypes, treat people as individuals, avoid assumptions. Question the reliability of sources. We're all scientists on this call. We make decisions based on evidence-based best practice. We've been hearing a lot of evidence all the way to today. Then think about that as to what you believe to be true. Why do you believe to be true? Question the resources. Did I just hear somebody say that? Was it a colleague? Did I read it on the Twitters? Or what is the evidence? Why do I believe this to be true? A good way to do that is argue with yourself. Find opposing evidence. And one of 2 things is going to happen. Either you're going to learn something new about the world around you, or you're going to validate something you already know. Both are good outcomes, but it takes intention. Probably one of the most important and profound ways to reduce discrimination is to take the time to get to know people who are different than you. Truly take that time. Get to know a transgender woman. Get to know somebody who survived residential school and experiences intergenerational trauma. Get to know their story. Get to know a woman who wears a niqab. And then you'll start to get to know the humans behind those stories. Get to know the patient, their name on that bed, and not just the broken arm in bed too. Get to know the humans, because I would argue that it is nearly impossible to discriminate against somebody that you have a human connection with. So start to build those human connections. And as I wrap up my time with you folks, I want you to think about the platinum rule, right? We all know the golden rule: do unto others the way that you wish to have done unto you. I challenge you to take it one step further and to do unto others the way they wish to be treated. This is different. It takes intention. It takes getting to know people who are different than you. It takes actively listening. It takes asking curious questions. Because as a white woman, I don't have the right to go into an Indigenous community and treat Indigenous women the way I expect to be treated. I don't have the right to go into a mosque and treat Muslim women the way I expect to be treated. We treat each other by meeting people where they're at, and we do that by being curious and getting to know each other. So as I think about bringing this to a close today, folks, I want you to think about, in these 25 minutes, maybe in your mind, you came up with one thing that you can do differently going forward. And maybe it's just saying good morning to somebody you haven't met. Whatever that is, find one thing that you can do and just start doing it. That's it. That's all my ask is of you. So I want to thank you for inviting me to be a part of this amazing day. And I'm going to sit back and listen to my other colleagues share what they have to share with you around EDI. Thank you, folks.